Imagine this: a police officer, filled with prejudice and fueled by assumptions, attacks a black man on a quiet street, believing he's just another person from the neighborhood. The scene is brutal, shocking, and sadly familiar. But what happens next is something no one expects. This ordinary man isn't just anyone. He's Reverend James Harris, one of the most influential pastors in the community, a man respected not only for his faith but for his tireless work in fighting for justice. The tables turn quickly, and the officer realizes that this time, his actions won't be swept under the rug. But before we dive into the story, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you enjoy stories with unexpected twists and life-changing moments, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. It was a cloudy, cold afternoon in Chicago when Reverend James Harris stepped out of his church after another day serving the community. He walked through familiar streets, greeting neighbors and locals with a serene smile, as he did every day. His mind was at peace, reflecting on the sermon he would deliver next Sunday, where he planned to speak about forgiveness and hope. But, unbeknownst to him, his tranquility was about to be brutally interrupted. A police car screeched to a halt at the corner, and out stepped Officer Mark Davis, his hand already on his gun and his eyes filled with suspicion. "Stop right there!" Mark's voice thundered, heavy with the authority of someone who seemed eager to assert control. The Reverend, surprised, slowly raised his hands, trying to show that he posed no threat. "Officer, is there something I can help you with?" he asked, maintaining the calmness that was his trademark, even in difficult situations. However, Mark wasn't interested in hearing anything. His heart pounded with the weight of old prejudices, and his vision was clouded by the belief that the black man standing before him was just another problem waiting to happen. Without giving him a chance to explain, Mark moved forward with violence. "You think you can walk around here like this, huh?" he yelled, shoving the Reverend against the wall with brutal force. The shock registered on James' face, as he struggled to comprehend the speed and ferocity of the encounter. The sound of his head hitting the bricks echoed down the empty street, and the few people nearby began to gather, their expressions shifting from shock to outrage. The injustice of the situation was becoming clearer with every passing second. "I haven't done anything, please," the Reverend tried to reason, his voice strained from the impact and pain. But Mark wasn't listening. He was blinded by anger, driven by the belief that he needed to assert his authority no matter the cost. His fists clenched tightly, and he delivered a punch to James' stomach, forcing him to double over in pain. The scene was terrifying, and the few bystanders began to shout, pleading for the officer to stop. "This is abuse. He hasn't done anything," a woman screamed, holding her phone, ready to record the incident. Each blow Mark delivered seemed to fuel the growing outrage among the onlookers. Faces twisted in horror turned into action, with people trying to move closer, only to be held back by fear of becoming the next victim. Between gasps of pain, the Reverend managed to say, "Officer, I am a man of faith," but Mark was relentless, throwing him to the ground as if he were a dangerous criminal. The tension in the air was thick, and the quiet neighborhood was quickly being overtaken by shouts and frantic calls for help. When the first person began filming, everything shifted. The sound of the camera recording carried a weight, as if it were documenting a living testament to the injustice unfolding. "This won't go unnoticed," a voice declared from the crowd. The officer, still unaware of who he had just assaulted, continued his aggressive behavior, believing he was in total control. But little did he know, this day would soon spiral into an irreversible turning point. What seemed like just another day on the job was about to become the beginning of a massive turning point. After what felt like an eternity, Mark finally stopped, panting. He glanced down at the man collapsed at his feet, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and contempt. Another thug off the streets, he thought, still oblivious to the real identity of James Harris. The Reverend, on the other hand, was struggling to get up, his arms shaking from pain and exhaustion. He knew that what had just happened wasn't just a physical assault, but an attack on everything he stood for: faith, compassion, love, and the fight for justice. Around them, murmurs were growing louder. The name, Reverend Harris, began to spread among the crowd, and the gravity of the situation was becoming clearer. "That's Reverend Harris. Do you even know what you've done?" shouted one man, as others began to close in on the officer, who now looked confused by the reactions around him. The realization that something bigger was at play started to settle in. This wasn't just an attack on an ordinary man. This was an assault on a spiritual leader, a pillar of the community, someone who had dedicated his life to spreading faith and hope. "You're going to pay for this," shouted another person, as the footage of the incident was quickly shared across social media. The video of the attack spread like wildfire, igniting the hearts of the community and thousands of people who, watching from their phones, saw the senseless brutality of the officer. Every second of that footage told a story of oppression and injustice, but it also spoke of courage and resistance. Reverend Harris, though injured, knew this was the beginning of something much bigger. A battle was about to begin, and he was determined to fight, not with violence, but with perseverance and faith. This attack, born out of prejudice, would become a symbol of everything that was wrong with the system. But it would also be the catalyst for a social revolution, a fight for overcoming and revealing the truth. The Reverend's courage to stand up, even after the violence he endured, would show the community that true strength lies in resilience and the ability to forgive, while never forgetting the need for justice. The stage was set, and the world was about to witness one of the greatest battles for love and compassion that this community had ever seen. Without Mark Davis realizing it, he had just lit a flame that would not easily be extinguished. That unjustified violence would be the spark for something far greater than he could ever have imagined. And, as he walked away from the scene, satisfied with what he believed to be just another job well done, Reverend Harris was preparing for the next phase of the fight. Faith would be his weapon, and perseverance his strategy. Everything was about to change. After the brutal attack, Officer Mark Davis returned to his patrol car, still unaware of the magnitude of his actions. As he drove away, a sinking feeling started to creep into his gut, as if something was off, but he couldn't quite place it. Meanwhile, the community was already rallying behind Reverend James Harris. His name was being spoken across social media and local news, not just as a victim, but as a highly respected figure, a beacon of hope and faith for the entire neighborhood. People were shocked that someone like him could be the target of such blatant violence. As the news began to spread, Mark started to receive calls. First, it was his supervisor, asking for an explanation about what happened on his patrol. The tone of the conversation was casual at first, but quickly turned cold. "Mark, do you have any idea who you just assaulted?" his supervisor asked, disbelief evident in his voice. Mark, still clueless, shrugged it off. "Just another guy causing trouble in the streets," he muttered. "No, Mark," came the sharp reply. "That man is Reverend James Harris, one of the most influential leaders in the black community. You didn't just attack anyone. You attacked a man of God." The weight of the words hit Mark like a punch to the gut. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. He replayed the scene in his head, his hands hitting the Reverend, the cries of the crowd, the unmistakable look of disappointment in their eyes. He had acted without thinking, driven by prejudice, but now he realized he hadn't just assaulted an ordinary man. Harris wasn't just another name. He was the reverend of one of the largest churches in the area, known for his powerful sermons on faith, perseverance, and love. The magnitude of his mistake was starting to settle in. Mark's mind raced as he scrolled through his phone, seeing the headlines pop up everywhere. "Reverend attacked by Chicago police," read one. "Community outraged after assault on respected pastor," blared another. Each new article brought with it a flood of angry comments, condemning not just Mark, but the entire system that had allowed such violence to happen. The officer felt his pulse quicken as panic began to take hold. He had crossed a line that he couldn't uncross, and the fallout was going to be immense. His career, his reputation, everything he had built was now hanging by a thread. As for Reverend Harris, he was being cared for by his congregation, still reeling from the shock of the attack. His face was bruised, and his body ached, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional toll. He had spent his life preaching about love and forgiveness, teaching his followers the power of faith and resilience. Yet here he was, the target of the very hate he had dedicated his life to fighting. His community rallied around him, not out of pity, but out of respect. They knew that if anyone could turn this terrible situation into a movement for change, it was Reverend James Harris. Meanwhile, Mark's life was spiraling out of control. He hadn't expected his actions to have such far-reaching consequences, but the truth of who he had assaulted was sinking in. Every call from the department felt heavier than the last, and the investigation was beginning to ramp up. "Mark, you've got to make a statement," said one of his colleagues. "The press is all over this." But what could he say? There was no excuse that could justify what he had done. He had acted out of anger, out of fear, and now the revelation of the Reverend's true identity was coming back to haunt him. The community's response was swift and passionate. People were furious, not just because of the attack, but because it represented a larger problem. If even someone like Reverend Harris isn't safe, what does that say about the rest of us? Asked one of the members of his church. The sentiment was echoed across the city. Reverend Harris wasn't just a victim, he was a symbol of everything that was wrong with the system, and a beacon of hope that things could be different. His name became synonymous with both the injustice that had occurred and the hope for something better. For Mark, the revelation of who Reverend Harris was felt like a slow-motion train wreck. Every time he turned on the TV, there was another story, another mention of his name, another piece of his life unraveling before his eyes. He had always seen himself as a good cop, maybe a bit rough around the edges, but good. Now, though, he was being painted as the villain. The officer who had brutally attacked a man of God. He hadn't just hurt a random person. He had hurt someone revered by thousands, someone whose very existence inspired courage and faith in a community that desperately needed it. Reverend Harris, though, wasn't focused on vengeance. He knew that the battle ahead wasn't about one man or one officer. It was about the system that had allowed such a thing to happen. Sitting in his home, surrounded by family and members of the church, he spoke softly but firmly. "This isn't about me," he said, wincing from the pain in his ribs. "This is about us, about all of us. We've been through worse, and we will persevere. But we have to turn this into something meaningful. We have to make sure this doesn't happen again." The more Mark learned about Reverend Harris, the more he realized how badly he had miscalculated. Harris wasn't just a pastor. He was a community leader, a social justice advocate, someone who had spent years fighting for the very people Mark had dismissed as troublemakers. As the officer sat alone in his apartment, staring at the TV, the gravity of his actions finally began to settle in. He had become the face of everything Reverend Harris stood against. The revelation wasn't just about Harris's identity. It was about the system, the culture, and the deep-rooted racism that had led him to that moment. Meanwhile, the city buzzed with the news of the attack. Harris's congregation was planning rallies, and civil rights activists were joining the cause. The attack wasn't just an isolated incident. It was the spark that ignited something larger. As more details of the assault came to light, the community's outrage grew. Reverend Harris had always preached about love, faith, and forgiveness, but now, more than ever, those words took on a new meaning. People were looking to him for guidance, and he knew that his next steps would determine the future of the movement. The revelation of Reverend Harris's true identity wasn't just a wake-up call for Mark, it was a wake-up call for the entire city. People who had been indifferent to issues of police violence were now paying attention. The attack had humanized the struggle, putting a familiar and beloved face on an issue that had, for many, felt distant. Reverend Harris was more than just a victim. He was a symbol of resilience, of courage, and of the power of faith to overcome even the most daunting challenges. And in the days to come, that revelation would fuel a movement that would shake the very foundations of the city. The news of Reverend James Harris's assault spread like wildfire. Within hours, videos of the incident were circulating across social media, and the anger among the community was palpable. The images of the beloved Reverend being brutally beaten by a police officer resonated deeply, sparking outrage and sorrow in equal measure. At the church, once a place of peace and reflection, people gathered, their faces a mixture of shock, sadness, and simmering anger. It wasn't just the violence that stirred them, it was the fact that someone like Reverend Harris, a symbol of hope and unity, could be treated with such cruelty. Conversations rippled through the crowd, voices hushed at first but growing louder with each passing minute. "How could this happen?" asked one woman, her eyes filled with tears. "He's done nothing but good for this community. He helps us, prays with us, fights for us, and this is how they treat him?" Another man, visibly angry, clenched his fists. "If they can attack someone like Reverend Harris, what chance do the rest of us have?" The mood was shifting from disbelief to fury. The community had long dealt with racial profiling and discrimination, but this attack felt like a direct strike at the heart of who they were. As more people gathered outside the church, local leaders began to speak out. The neighborhood, already tense from years of strained relations with the police, found itself on the edge. "This isn't just about one man," declared a community organizer standing on the church steps. "This is about all of us. They want to silence us, control us, make us live in fear. But we won't let them. Not this time." The crowd erupted in agreement, their voices rising in a collective cry for justice. What had begun as a small gathering was quickly turning into the start of a movement. The community was no longer willing to stay silent. The anger wasn't confined to just the streets around the church. Social media amplified the voices of the outraged, as people from all over the city and beyond shared their thoughts and frustrations. Hashtags calling for justice for Reverend Harris began trending, as the video of the attack garnered millions of views. Comments flooded in, not only from locals but from people around the country, shocked by the brazenness of the violence. The images of the Reverend, a man who had devoted his life to faith and love, lying beaten on the pavement, ignited a fire in the hearts of those who watched. As the community's anger grew, so did its determination to act. Meetings were quickly organized, and the church became a hub of activity. People who had never before considered themselves activists were suddenly volunteering, eager to lend their voices to the growing cry for change. "We need to take action," one young woman said, standing in front of a group of local students. "This isn't just about Reverend Harris. This is about all of us, our families, our friends. We have to make sure this never happens again." Her words echoed through the room, met with nods of agreement. There was no turning back now. At the same time, local news stations began covering the story in greater detail. The Reverend's congregation had always been known for its commitment to social justice, and now the spotlight was on them. Reporters swarmed the church, interviewing members of the community and broadcasting their voices to the world. "Reverend Harris has been our guide, our shepherd," one woman told a camera crew, her voice shaking with emotion. "He's taught us to have faith, to keep going even when things are hard. But how can we keep faith in a system that allows this kind of violence?" The frustration of the community was boiling over, and the demand for justice was clear. But amidst the anger, There was also a sense of fear. Fear that the violence could escalate, that the authorities would respond with force. "We need to stay peaceful," said one of the church leaders during a late-night meeting. "If we meet their violence with more violence, we'll lose everything Reverend Harris stands for. We can't give them that satisfaction." But it was hard for many to suppress their rage. Years of systemic oppression and discrimination had built up, and this attack on their beloved leader felt like the last straw. The church, once a sanctuary for quiet prayer and reflection, had become the epicenter of a growing movement. Discussions about police brutality and racism, topics that had always simmered beneath the surface, were now at the forefront of every conversation. "We've been dealing with this for too long," said one elder in the community. "It's time we stand up, not just for Reverend Harris, but for every single person who's been wronged by this system." His words were met with applause. The community wasn't just angry, they were ready for change. As night fell, the protests outside the church grew larger. People from other neighborhoods started arriving, carrying signs and chanting slogans of unity and justice. What began as a local incident was quickly turning into something much bigger. The streets echoed with chants of "No justice, no peace," and "We are all Reverend Harris." There was an energy in the air, a feeling that the time for complacency had passed. The community had been pushed too far, and now they were pushing back, fueled by a deep sense of injustice and the hope for a better future. The police, meanwhile, were growing increasingly uneasy. They knew they had crossed a line, and the pressure from the public was mounting. Calls for investigations and accountability were being made at every level. But the community didn't trust that justice would be served. "They always say they'll investigate," said one man, his voice bitter. "But how many times have we heard that before? How many times have they promised change, only for nothing to happen?" His words captured the sentiment of many in the crowd. This time, they wouldn't settle for empty promises. As the protests gained momentum, so too did the media attention. National news outlets picked up the story, and soon, people across the country were watching the events unfold. Commentators debated the case on television, with some calling for immediate justice, while others cautioned patience. But for those in the community, patience had long since worn thin. The attack on Reverend Harris had struck a deep chord, and the people were ready to fight, not with fists, but with their voices, their unity, and their faith. By the end of the first night, it was clear that this was only the beginning. The community had been galvanized, their anger transformed into action. As they stood outside the church, holding candles and signs, they knew they were part of something much bigger than themselves. They were part of a movement for justice, for dignity, for the right to live without fear of violence and oppression. And as they looked around at one another, they saw not just anger, but hope. Hope that, together, they could bring about the change they had been waiting for. The next morning, the streets around Reverend Harris's church were alive with activity. What had begun as small gatherings of concerned citizens was now turning into something much larger. Religious leaders from across Chicago, pastors, priests, rabbis, were arriving to show their support. The air was thick with determination as leaders from different faiths stood together, united against the violence that had occurred. "This isn't just about one faith," said Father Michael, a Catholic priest who had known Reverend Harris for years. "This is about justice, compassion, and the dignity of every human being." Inside the church, despite the bruises still visible on his face, Reverend Harris was preparing to address his congregation. The attack had left him shaken, but not defeated. He knew that the eyes of not just his community, but the whole country, were on him now. As he stood before the gathering crowd, he could see their pain, their anger, but also their faith in him. "My friends," he began, his voice calm but resolute, "we are here today not to sow division, but to plant the seeds of change. We will not be silent in the face of injustice, but we will not let anger rule our hearts." The crowd, packed inside the church and spilling out onto the street, erupted in applause. Harris's words, filled with faith and perseverance, resonated with the deep emotions of the people gathered. But this wasn't just a gathering of one faith, it was a unification of many. Muslim leaders spoke of peace, Jewish leaders spoke of solidarity, and Christian pastors emphasized the power of love over hate. It was a collective stand against systemic racism, police brutality, and the ongoing discrimination that had plagued their city for too long. As the leaders spoke, plans for a large, peaceful protest began to take shape. They wanted the world to see the strength of their unity and the power of their convictions. "We must walk together, hand in hand," said Reverend Harris, "not as individuals, but as one community, one voice." His words were met with nods of agreement. There was no room for violence in their movement. They would fight with faith, with perseverance, and with hope. The protest would be their way of showing that love could indeed triumph over hate, that faith could conquer fear. That afternoon, the streets of Chicago were filled with thousands of people. Protesters marched side by side, holding signs that read "Justice for Reverend Harris" and "End Police Violence." Their voices echoed through the city, a powerful chorus calling for change. Alongside them marched religious leaders, activists, and even celebrities who had come to show their support. The protest, which had started as a local demonstration, was now gaining national attention. News cameras rolled as the peaceful sea of people moved through the streets, their chants steady and unwavering. Despite the size of the protest, the atmosphere remained peaceful. There was an air of solemn determination, but also of hope. "This is about more than one man," said a young woman marching with her family. "This is about creating a world where we don't have to be afraid of those who are supposed to protect us." Her words struck a chord with those around her, many of whom had experienced similar fears in their own lives. The march wasn't just a show of solidarity, it was a demand for systemic change, for justice, for an end to the violence that had torn apart too many families. As the protest continued, the police presence grew. Officers lined the streets, watching as the peaceful marchers passed by. For a moment, there was tension in the air, the memory of the violence against Reverend Harris still fresh in everyone's minds. But the protesters remained calm, their resolve unshaken. Reverend Harris himself led the march, his arm still bandaged, but his spirit stronger than ever. "We will not be moved," he declared to the crowd as they reached the city's center. His words were met with cheers, as the thousands gathered knew that they were part of something much larger than themselves. Back at the church, preparations were being made for what was to come next. The leaders of the various religious groups had agreed that this movement couldn't just be a one-time protest. They needed to sustain their momentum, to continue their fight for justice beyond the streets. "This can't stop here," said a young pastor, his voice filled with determination. "We need to keep organizing, keep speaking out. This is only the beginning." The sentiment was shared by all. They knew that while the march was a powerful statement, it was only the first step in a much longer journey. As evening fell, the protest dispersed peacefully. The streets, which had been filled with the sounds of chanting and marching, were now quiet again. But the energy from the day still lingered in the air. Reverend Harris returned to his church, exhausted but hopeful. He knew that this was just the beginning of a much larger movement, one that would require faith, perseverance, and love. The peaceful protest had shown the world that the community would not be silenced, that they would stand together against injustice. But Harris also knew that the battle for justice was far from over. The movement, which had started in the streets of Chicago, was now beginning to spread. People from other cities were organizing their own protests, inspired by the unity and strength shown in Chicago. Religious leaders across the country were speaking out, calling for systemic change and an end to police brutality. "This isn't just a Chicago issue," said one rabbi at a rally in New York. "This is a national issue, and we must all stand together." The movement for justice was growing, and Reverend Harris knew that their faith and determination would be key to seeing it through. As he sat in his office that evening, reflecting on the events of the day, Harris felt a deep sense of gratitude for the people who had stood by him. He knew that the fight ahead would be difficult, but he also knew that he wasn't alone. His community, his faith, and the unity of those around him gave him the strength to keep going. The peaceful protest had been a powerful start, but there was still much work to be done. "This is our moment," he whispered to himself. "We will not stop until justice is served." In the days following the peaceful protest, the pressure on the Chicago Police Department intensified. The community was no longer just demanding answers, they were demanding justice. Calls flooded into city officials' offices, from citizens, activists, and even political leaders, all asking the same question: what will be done about Officer Mark Davis? The pressure mounted with each passing day, and the department, known for dragging its feet in such investigations, could no longer ignore the outcry. The wheels of internal investigations had been set in motion, but the community was growing impatient. Inside the police department, tension was high. Mark Davis had been placed on administrative leave, but this did little to appease the public. "It's not enough," said one community leader during a press conference outside City Hall. "We've seen this story play out too many times. An officer gets suspended, there's an investigation, and then nothing happens. We won't allow that this time." His words echoed the frustration of thousands. For too long, the police had operated with impunity, but now the people were demanding real accountability, not just for Reverend Harris but for all victims of police violence. The media played a crucial role in keeping the pressure on. News channels ran constant updates on the case, while social media amplified every new development. Hashtags calling for justice for Reverend Harris continued to trend, and the video of the attack had now been viewed by millions. National figures, from politicians to civil rights activists, began weighing in. "This isn't just about Chicago," said one well-known activist during a televised interview. "This is a systemic issue. Police brutality is a plague in this country, and it won't stop unless we all stand up and demand change." As the investigation into Officer Davis progressed, new details emerged that only fueled the community's anger. It was revealed that Davis had a history of complaints against him, many of which had been quietly dismissed by the department. This revelation shocked no one in the community but further undermined trust in the police. "How many warnings did they need?" asked one woman during a town hall meeting. "How many people have to suffer before they take action? This man should have been off the streets long ago." Her words rang true for many, and the sense of betrayal deepened. Meanwhile, the legal battle for justice was beginning to take shape. Reverend Harris, with the support of his congregation and legal counsel, filed a lawsuit against the city and the police department, seeking not just compensation, but systemic reforms. "This isn't about money," Reverend Harris told reporters gathered outside the courthouse. "This is about accountability. We're not just fighting for me, we're fighting for every person who's been wronged by this system." His message was clear. This was a fight for justice, not just for himself, but for the countless others whose voices had been silenced. Behind closed doors, city officials were scrambling to contain the situation. The protests had not died down, and every day brought new waves of demonstrators to the streets. "We need to show the public that we're taking this seriously," one city official said during an emergency meeting. "If we don't, we risk losing control of the situation entirely." But finding a solution was proving difficult. The police department was resistant to outside scrutiny, and there was a growing divide between city leaders and law enforcement. The fight for justice was becoming a political battle as well. As the legal proceedings began, Reverend Harris became a symbol of resilience and faith in the face of adversity. Despite the physical and emotional toll the attack had taken on him, he continued to lead his congregation, urging them to remain peaceful and focused. Our fight is not with individuals, he told them during one particularly emotional sermon. Our fight is with the system that allows this kind of violence to happen. And we will fight it with faith, with love, and with perseverance. His words struck a chord with his followers, many of whom had experienced similar struggles in their own lives. The lawsuit against the police department brought with it a flood of attention. Civil rights groups from across the country offered their support, some even joining the case as co-plaintiffs. The legal team working on behalf of Reverend Harris was preparing for a long and difficult fight. "We're not just seeking justice for Reverend Harris," said one of the lead attorneys during a press briefing. "We're seeking justice for every person who has been wronged by this system. This case has the potential to set a precedent, to bring about real change in how police departments operate." The police department, however, wasn't going down without a fight. Their legal team mounted a defense, attempting to shift the narrative by questioning Reverend Harris's actions during the incident. It was a familiar tactic, one often used to discredit victims of police violence. But the community wasn't having it. "We all saw the video," said one protester outside the courthouse. "We know what happened. This isn't about what Reverend Harris did or didn't do. This is about a police officer who used excessive force and needs to be held accountable." As the case dragged on, the pressure on the police department continued to grow. Calls for the resignation of the police chief became louder, and many were demanding a complete overhaul of the department's practices. "We need more than just one officer being held accountable," said a prominent civil rights leader. "We need reforms, real reforms, that will prevent this from happening again. We need to change the culture of policing in this country, and it starts here in Chicago." His words were met with cheers from the crowd. The community was tired of waiting for change. They were ready to fight for it. With each passing day, the pressure on the police department became harder to ignore. Investigators from outside agencies were brought in to review the case, and the eyes of the nation were focused on what would happen next. Reverend Harris's fight for justice had become a symbol of the larger struggle for civil rights, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. The battle was far from over, but one thing was clear. The community, united by faith and perseverance, would not back down until justice was served. The crowd gathered outside the courthouse had grown to thousands by the time Reverend James Harris stepped up to the podium. His body still bore the marks of the assault, but his spirit was stronger than ever. The air was thick with anticipation. The community looked to him not only for leadership but for hope. As he stood before them, the weight of the moment was palpable. The cameras flashed, the murmurs quieted, and all eyes were on him. Reverend Harris took a deep breath and began to speak, his voice soft but filled with a quiet strength. "My brothers and sisters," he began, his eyes scanning the sea of faces before him. "We stand here today, not in anger, but in faith. We stand united, not just as individuals, but as a community, as a family. What happened to me was wrong. It was an act of violence, an act of injustice. But I tell you today, we must not let that injustice define us. We must rise above it, and we must do so with love in our hearts." His words resonated deeply, the silence of the crowd a testament to the power of his message. The Reverend paused for a moment, allowing the weight of his words to sink in. He could feel the pain of his community, the years of frustration and oppression, but he also felt their strength, their resilience. "They tried to silence us," he continued, his voice growing louder, "but they do not understand that our faith makes us stronger. Every time they knock us down, we will rise again. We will rise with courage, with perseverance, and with hope." His voice cracked slightly, but it only added to the emotion of the moment, and the crowd began to stir, their energy rising with his words. "This is not just about me," he said, his voice steady again. "This is about every man, woman, and child who has been wronged by a system that does not see them, does not hear them. But we will be seen. We will be heard. And we will do it not with violence, but with faith, with hope, with love." The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers echoing through the streets. For so long, they had felt powerless, but now, standing together, they felt the power of their unity, their shared purpose. Reverend Harris continued, his voice rising with conviction. "We will not meet their hate with hate. We will meet it with love. We will not fight their violence with violence. We will fight it with peace, with justice. For too long, we have been told to wait, to be patient. But our patience has not been rewarded. And now, it is time for us to act, to demand the justice we deserve. But we will do it the way we have always done it, with faith and perseverance, with courage and compassion." His words were met with another wave of cheers, the crowd hanging on to every word. "I know you are tired," he said, his voice softening again. "I know you are angry. And I know many of you want to fight back in ways that may seem easier, more immediate. But I ask you, I beg you, do not let them take away the peace in your hearts. Do not let them steal your hope. We must be better than that. We must show them that our strength comes not from our fists, but from our faith." Tears welled up in the eyes of many in the crowd, their hearts moved by his call for peace amidst the chaos. As he neared the end of his speech, Reverend Harris's voice took on a tone of quiet determination. "We are fighting for something much bigger than ourselves," he said. "We are fighting for the future of our children, for the dignity of our community, for the soul of this nation. And we will not stop until justice is served. But let us remember, justice is not revenge. Justice is fairness, it is equality, it is love. And it is only through love that we will overcome this darkness." The crowd stood in rapt attention, many nodding in agreement, their spirits lifted by his words. Finally, Reverend Harris spoke the words that had been building in the hearts of everyone present. "I forgive the man who hurt me," he said, his voice clear and unwavering. "Not because he deserves it, but because I refuse to carry hate in my heart. We must forgive, but we must also demand justice. Forgiveness is not weakness. It is strength. It is the strength to move forward, to build a better world, not just for ourselves, but for those who come after us." The crowd exploded in applause, their voices rising in unison as they cheered for the man who had not only led them through the darkness but had shown them the light. As the crowd began to disperse, many of them still buzzing with the energy of the Reverend's words, there was a sense that something profound had taken place. This wasn't just a speech, it was a call to action, a call to rise above the pain and anger and to move forward with hope and unity. The battle for justice was far from over, but the community now had a renewed sense of purpose, a clear vision of the path ahead. Reverend Harris's words had ignited a spark of hope, and that hope would carry them forward in the fight for change. Reverend Harris, though exhausted from the ordeal, felt a deep sense of peace as he watched his community come together. He knew that this was just the beginning, that the road ahead would be long and difficult. But he also knew that with faith, perseverance, and unity, they could overcome any obstacle. His speech had been more than just words. It had been a declaration of faith, a testament to the power of love and forgiveness. And as the crowd left the courthouse, they carried that message with them, ready to face whatever came next with courage and hope in their hearts. Months had passed since the fateful day when Reverend Harris was attacked, but the ripples of that moment continued to spread far and wide. What began as a single act of police brutality had grown into a national movement, one that demanded not just justice for Reverend Harris, but systemic reform within the police force. The streets of Chicago, once filled with protests and anger, now held a different energy, one of resilience and determination. The community was tired of waiting for change, and with Reverend Harris as their guide, they had pushed for reforms that were now taking shape. The first victory came when the Chicago Police Department announced sweeping changes to its training protocols. The department, under immense pressure, had no choice but to introduce mandatory anti-racism and de-escalation training for all officers. "It's a start," said one community leader, her voice cautious but hopeful. "It's not enough, but it's something. We'll keep fighting until every officer understands that their duty is to protect and serve, not to dominate and control." The reforms were far from perfect, but they represented a shift, a recognition that the system had failed and needed to be rebuilt from the ground up. For Reverend Harris, the changes were a step in the right direction, but he knew the work was far from over. "This is just the beginning," he told his congregation during one of his sermons. "True justice isn't about punishing one man. It's about changing the system that allowed that man to act with impunity in the first place. It's about ensuring that what happened to me never happens to anyone else." His words were met with nods of agreement. The community understood that while the fight for justice had begun with one incident, it had grown into something much larger, a fight for systemic change. Across the country, other cities began to take notice of what was happening in Chicago. Inspired by Reverend Harris's leadership and the peaceful protests that had led to real change, activists in cities like New York, Los Angeles, and Atlanta began pushing for similar reforms. The movement for police reform was no longer isolated. It had become a national conversation. "We saw what happened in Chicago," said an activist in New York. "And we know that if they can make these changes there, we can do it here too. This isn't just a Chicago problem. It's an American problem." As the reforms took hold, the relationship between the police and the community began to shift, albeit slowly. Officers were now required to attend community events, to listen to the concerns of the people they were sworn to protect. Programs were set up to create dialogue between the police and the neighborhoods they patrolled. It wasn't an easy transition. Years of mistrust couldn't be undone overnight, but the seeds of change had been planted. "It's not perfect," said one young man during a town hall meeting, "but at least now we're talking. At least now, they're listening." Reverend Harris watched these changes unfold with a mix of pride and caution. He knew that real change wouldn't happen overnight, but he also knew that they had come a long way since that day outside the church. "We've shown them that we won't be silenced," he said during a community meeting. "We've shown them that when we come together, when we stand united, we can create change. But we must remain vigilant. The fight for justice is ongoing, and we cannot rest until every person in this country is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve." The reforms in Chicago began to inspire other kinds of change as well. Schools and businesses in the area started programs aimed at educating people about racial injustice, inequality, and the importance of standing up for one another. "This isn't just about the police," said one teacher during a community event. "This is about how we treat each other, how we see each other. We have to start teaching our children that love, compassion, and understanding are the values that will build a better future." These efforts were small but meaningful, planting the seeds for a new generation that would grow up understanding the importance of unity and justice. As the months turned into years, the memory of Reverend Harris's attack remained, but it had transformed from a symbol of pain into a catalyst for hope. The reforms in Chicago, while not perfect, were seen as a model for other cities across the nation. The police department, once seen as an untouchable institution, was now being held accountable in ways that had never been possible before. Officers who violated the new protocols faced real consequences, and the community, while still cautious, began to rebuild a fragile trust in the system. For Reverend Harris, the journey had been long and exhausting, but he knew that the fight had been worth it. "We've come a long way," he said during a speech at a national civil rights conference. "But our work is far from finished. We cannot be complacent. We cannot think that just because we've won some battles, the war is over. Justice is not a destination, it's a journey, and we must continue to walk that path, together, with faith, with perseverance, and with love." His words echoed the same message he had preached from the beginning, and they were met with thunderous applause. The fight for justice that had begun on the streets of Chicago was now a national movement, one that continued to grow and evolve. Reverend Harris's story, once a painful example of police brutality, had become a beacon of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest times, there is always light. His leadership, his unwavering faith, and his belief in the power of love and forgiveness had carried the movement forward, and his message had inspired people far beyond the city limits. As Reverend Harris looked out over the crowd of the conference, he saw faces from all walks of life, young and old, black and white, rich and poor, all united by a common purpose. They had come together, just as he had always hoped they would, to fight for a better future. And though the road ahead was still long, he knew that they would continue to walk it, step by step, with faith and hope lighting the way. As we come to the end of this powerful story, the lessons we've uncovered are impossible to ignore. Think about the strength it takes to face injustice head-on, not with violence, but with perseverance, faith, and the hope for a better tomorrow. Reverend Harris's journey reminds us that real change doesn't come from rage or revenge. It comes from standing firm in your values, no matter how hard the road gets. The reforms that followed, the unity that grew from a moment of hate, and the ongoing fight for justice all show us that progress is possible when we refuse to back down. Now, the question is, what will you do with these lessons? How can you, in your own life, stand up against the injustices you see around you? Whether it's speaking out when you witness wrongdoing or educating yourself and others on how to build a more just and compassionate society, the power to create change is in your hands. Will you continue to wait for someone else to take the first step, or will you lead the charge for a better world, just as Reverend Harris did? If you've been inspired by this story, don't let the conversation stop here. There's more to learn, more to explore, and so much more you can do. Make sure to subscribe to the channel, activate notifications, and stay with us as we continue diving into stories that push for change and challenge the status quo. Together, we can keep learning, keep growing, and keep pushing for the justice we all deserve.